The morning sun cast long shadows across the polished granite steps of Henderson Tower, a gleaming 30-story monument to success in the heart of Chicago's financial district. Built in 1987, the building had weathered economic storms and market fluctuations to become one of the most prestigious commercial addresses in the city. Its brass nameplate, weathered by decades of wind and rain, still gleamed with the pride of architectural achievement. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Inside the expansive marble lobby, crystal chandeliers hung like frozen fireworks, casting prismatic light across imported Italian stone floors. The space hummed with the quiet efficiency of morning commerce, elevator bells chiming softly, heels clicking against marble, the rustle of newspapers and briefcases as Chicago's business elite began another day of deals and decisions. At 41 years old, Jasmine Crawford had built an empire that most people could only dream of. Standing 5'6" with natural hair pulled back in an elegant bun, she possessed the kind of quiet confidence that came from years of proving herself in rooms where she was often the only person who looked like her. Her tailored navy blazer and matching skirt spoke of success earned through intelligence, persistence, and an unshakable belief in her own vision. Jasmine was the founder and sole owner of Crawford Properties, a real estate investment firm that had quietly assembled one of the most impressive commercial portfolios in the Midwest. Over 15 years, she had transformed a small inheritance from her grandmother into a multi-million-dollar enterprise that owned 17 buildings across 3 states. But Henderson Tower was her crown jewel, the first major property she had purchased when others doubted a young black woman could handle such a significant investment. She had bought the building 8 years ago when it was hemorrhaging tenants and struggling with outdated systems. Through careful renovation, strategic marketing, and relentless attention to detail, she had transformed it into a fully occupied, highly sought-after address. The building now housed 3 law firms, 2 accounting practices, a prestigious consulting group, a hedge fund, and several smaller professional services companies. Each tenant paid premium rates for the privilege of calling Henderson Tower home. This morning, Jasmine was returning from a 3-week business trip to Germany, where she had been exploring opportunities in international commercial real estate. The trip had been successful beyond her expectations. She had secured partnerships that would allow her to expand into European markets within the next 2 years. Her phone buzzed constantly with messages from her assistant, property managers, and tenants who had questions that had accumulated during her absence. The taxi dropped her at the corner of LaSalle and Madison, and she walked the final block to Henderson Tower, pulling her designer luggage behind her. The familiar sight of her building always filled her with pride, but this morning she noticed something different. There was a new security guard posted at the main entrance, a young man she didn't recognize, wearing a crisp uniform and standing with military straight posture. Jasmine had specifically instructed her property management team to inform all security personnel about her extended absence and expected return. She assumed the new guard had been briefed about building ownership and key personnel. It was a reasonable assumption that would prove to be entirely wrong. Marcus Johnson, 26 years old and 3 weeks into his new job, had been hired by Pinnacle Security Services to cover the Henderson Tower contract. He was eager to prove himself in his first downtown assignment, after working in smaller office buildings in the suburbs. The Pinnacle training manual emphasized vigilance, protocol adherence, and maintaining the building's prestigious image. What it hadn't emphasized was flexibility, human judgment, or the importance of understanding the building's actual ownership structure. Marcus had been told that Henderson Tower housed important tenants who valued security and discretion. He had memorized the faces of several key executives whose photos were in his briefing materials, but Jasmine's photo wasn't among them. The property management company had failed to update the security files with current ownership information, an oversight that would have significant consequences. From Marcus's perspective, his job was straightforward. Ensure that only authorized personnel entered the building, maintain professional appearance standards, and prevent any situations that might reflect poorly on Henderson Tower's reputation. He took these responsibilities seriously, perhaps too seriously. When Jasmine approached the brass and glass entrance doors, Marcus stepped forward with practiced authority. In his mind, she didn't fit the profile of Henderson Tower's typical morning traffic. Her luggage suggested she might be a delivery person or service worker, and her casual confidence seemed at odds with the deferential attitude he expected from building visitors. The morning rush was in full swing around them. Well-dressed professionals hurried past on the sidewalk, coffee cups in hand, phones pressed to ears, the urgent energy of a business district coming to life. Inside the lobby, Jasmine could see familiar faces. Mr. Peterson from the law firm on the 15th floor, Sandra Williams, who managed the accounting practice on 12, various assistants and junior executives she recognized from countless elevator conversations over the years. But Marcus saw none of this context. He saw an unfamiliar black woman with luggage approaching a building he was paid to protect, and his training kicked in with unfortunate precision. As Jasmine reached for the door handle, a motion she had performed thousands of times as the building's owner, Marcus's hand shot out to block her path. The gesture was swift and definitive, the universal signal that access was denied. The moment crystallized with uncomfortable clarity. Behind Marcus, through the glass doors, Jasmine could see her building humming with morning activity. Tenants she had personally recruited occupied offices she had renovated. The marble floors she had restored gleamed under chandeliers she had selected. Even the security uniform Marcus wore had been purchased through a contract she had negotiated and approved. Yet here she stood, blocked from entering her own property by a guard who had decided, in the space of a few seconds, that she didn't belong. Jasmine's expression remained composed, but inside, a familiar tightness began forming in her chest. It was the same sensation she had experienced in countless boardrooms, investment meetings, and professional gatherings throughout her career. The moment when competence was questioned, not because of performance, but because of perception. She had built Henderson Tower's success, tenant by tenant, renovation by renovation, decision by decision. She knew every floor plan, every maintenance schedule, every lease agreement. She had personally approved Marcus's hiring through the property management company she employed. Yet none of that history, none of that authority, mattered in this moment. What mattered was assumption, bias, and the terrible power of first impressions. "Excuse me, ma'am," Marcus said, his voice carrying the practiced authority of security training. "I'm going to need to see your identification and building authorization before you can enter." Jasmine paused, her hand still reaching toward the door handle she had grasped countless times before. The request itself wasn't unreasonable. Security protocols existed for good reasons. What struck her immediately was the tone. The assumption embedded in Marcus's posture that she was someone who needed permission to be here. "I'm sorry," she replied, genuinely confused by the sudden barrier to her own building. Marcus straightened his shoulders, interpreting her question as resistance rather than surprise. "This is a secure building, ma'am. All visitors need to check in with security and be authorized by a tenant before gaining access. Do you have an appointment scheduled with one of our companies?" The word visitor hung in the air between them like a challenge. Around them, other professionals continued streaming into Henderson Tower, most nodding politely at Marcus as they passed. Jasmine noticed that none of them were being stopped, questioned, or asked to produce identification. The disparity was stark and unmistakable. "I'm not a visitor," Jasmine said calmly, reaching into her purse for her building access card. "I work here." She withdrew a sleek black key card with Henderson Tower Executive Access printed in gold lettering. It was the master access card, programmed to open every door in the building, from the basement parking garage to the executive offices on the 30th floor. She had designed the security system herself during the building's renovation. Marcus examined the card with the skeptical attention of someone trained to spot forgeries. He turned it over in his hands, studying the magnetic strip and holographic security features. His frown deepened as he processed what he was seeing. "Where did you get this?" he asked, his tone shifting from procedural to suspicious. The question struck Jasmine like a physical blow. In all her years of business ownership, through countless negotiations and professional challenges, no one had ever questioned her right to possess her own property credentials. "I didn't get it anywhere," she replied, her voice maintaining its professional composure despite the rising tension. "It was issued to me." Marcus's training had covered various security scenarios, but none had prepared him for this moment. The access card appeared legitimate, but his instincts told him something wasn't right. In his mind, executive-level credentials belonged to the senior partners and corporate officers, whose photos were in his briefing materials. The disconnect between Jasmine's appearance and his expectations created cognitive dissonance that resolved itself through suspicion rather than reconsideration. "Ma'am, I'm gonna need you to wait here while I verify this with the property management office," Marcus said, pulling out his radio. There might be some confusion about authorization levels. The word confusion carried particular weight. It suggested that Jasmine's presence, her credentials, her very existence in this space was somehow problematic, something that needed to be sorted out by higher authorities. Behind the glass doors, Henderson Tower's morning rhythm continued, undisturbed. Jasmine could see the elevator bank where she had stood countless times, greeting tenants and discussing building improvements. She could see the reception desk, where packages addressed to her arrived daily. She could see the directory board that listed Crawford Properties as the building management company. But Marcus saw none of this context. He saw a situation that didn't match his training scenarios, and his response was to escalate rather than investigate. "Marcus, this is building security," he spoke into his radio. "I have a situation at the main entrance. I need someone from property management to verify an access card." The radio crackled back with static and a bored voice. "Copy that. What's the nature of the issue?" Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Marcus glanced at Jasmine, then spoke in a lower tone that she could still hear clearly. "I have an individual claiming to have executive access, but I don't have them in my authorization files." The phrase "claiming to have" transformed legitimate ownership into suspicious assertion. It reduced Jasmine's 8 years of building ownership, her millions in investment, her careful cultivation of Henderson Tower's success, into a claim that required verification by others. Jasmine felt the familiar sensation of being reduced to an assumption, stripped of agency and authority by someone who had decided her presence was inherently questionable. But this time was different. This wasn't a boardroom where she needed to prove her qualifications, or a bank where she had to demonstrate her creditworthiness. This was her building, purchased with her money, improved through her vision, operated under her oversight. "Marcus," she said, reading his nameplate, "I understand you're doing your job, but there's been a misunderstanding. I'm Jasmine Crawford. I own this building." The statement landed with uncomfortable precision. Marcus's radio continued crackling with intermittent chatter, but the immediate space around them seemed to quiet. A few passers-by slowed their pace, sensing tension without understanding its source. Marcus's expression shifted through several emotions in rapid succession: disbelief, confusion, and something approaching panic. Building ownership wasn't covered in his training manual. The possibility that he might be questioning the property owner had never been presented as a scenario he might encounter. That's not possible," he said, though his voice carried less certainty than his words suggested. "I would have been informed about building ownership. It would be in my briefing materials." Jasmine recognized the tone, the defensive response of someone whose assumptions were being challenged by reality. She had heard it countless times in business settings, the moment when people realized their preconceptions might be wrong but weren't yet ready to abandon them. "Your briefing materials are apparently incomplete," she said evenly, "but I can resolve this very quickly. I have the building keys, the master codes, and about 8 years of documentation proving ownership. Would you like to see them?" The offer was reasonable, professional, and generous under the circumstances. It provided Marcus with a face-saving way to correct his mistake, while maintaining his dignity and authority. But Marcus was young, undertrained, and increasingly aware that he might be in over his head. His response was to double down rather than step back. "Ma'am, I'm going to need you to wait for property management to arrive before we proceed with any verification," he said, his voice taking on an edge of authority that masked his growing uncertainty. The refusal to allow Jasmine to prove her own identity at her own building marked a point of no return. What had begun as a procedural misunderstanding was crystallizing into something more problematic: a young security guard's determination to assert authority over the person who had hired him, paid his salary, and owned every square foot of the property he was protecting. Around them, the morning rush continued its relentless pace, but the dynamic at Henderson Tower's entrance had shifted into something more complex and potentially explosive than either Marcus or Jasmine had anticipated. The radio crackled to life with a response that would change everything. "Security, this is Jennifer at Property Management. I'm reviewing the tenant directory now, but I don't see any Crawford properties listed as having executive access privileges. Can you describe the individual in question? Marcus glanced at Jasmine with what he clearly believed was vindication. The property management confirmation seemed to support his suspicions, validating his decision to question her credentials. Subject is an African-American female, approximately 40 years old, carrying luggage and claiming building ownership, Marcus spoke into the radio, his voice carrying the clinical detachment of a security report. The description reduced Jasmine to a series of observable characteristics, stripping away her identity, accomplishments, and legitimate presence. She felt the familiar sting of being categorized rather than recognized, reduced to demographic data rather than acknowledged as an individual with agency and authority. "Copy that," Jennifer's voice responded through the static. "I'll be down in 5 minutes to sort this out. Keep her there until I arrive." The phrase "keep her there" transformed Jasmine from a person seeking entry to her own building into a subject requiring containment. The shift was subtle but profound, marking the moment when procedural caution became something approaching detention. Jasmine pulled out her phone and began scrolling through her contacts. She had dozens of numbers for building tenants, property managers, contractors, and city officials who could verify her identity within minutes. But the principle involved went deeper than simple verification. She shouldn't have to prove her right to enter property she owned, shouldn't have to call references to validate her existence in a space she had created and cultivated. "Who are you calling?" Marcus asked, his tone suggesting that phone calls were somehow suspicious behavior. "My attorney," Jasmine replied calmly, though her patience was wearing thin. "Since you seem determined to treat me like a trespasser on my own property, I think it's time to document this interaction professionally." The mention of legal representation sent a visible jolt through Marcus's demeanor. His security training had covered many scenarios, but none had prepared him for the possibility that his actions might have legal consequences. The confident authority he had projected began showing cracks. "Ma'am, there's no need to involve attorneys," he said quickly. "We're just following standard security protocols. Property management will be here shortly to clear this up." But Jasmine was already dialing. She selected David Kim from her contacts, not her attorney, but the managing partner of Kim, Patterson and Associates, the law firm that occupied the entire 14th floor of Henderson Tower. David had been one of her first tenants when she purchased the building, and their professional relationship had evolved into genuine friendship over the years. "David, it's Jasmine," she said when he answered. "I'm standing outside Henderson Tower being prevented from entering my own building by a security guard who doesn't believe I own it." Even through the phone, David's surprise was audible. "What? Jasmine, that's ridiculous. Where are you exactly?" "Main entrance. The guard has called property management for verification of my identity," she said, her voice carrying just enough emphasis to convey the absurdity of the situation. "I'll be right down," David said immediately. "This is completely unacceptable." Marcus overheard enough of the conversation to realize that Jasmine's connections to building tenants were real and immediate. His confidence began wavering as he processed the implications. If she was indeed legitimate, his actions were rapidly escalating from procedural caution to potential liability. "Ma'am, maybe we should wait for property management before involving more people," he suggested, but his tone had lost its earlier authority. "More people?" Jasmine replied. "You mean more people who can confirm what I've been telling you from the beginning?" The elevator chimed inside the lobby, and David Kim emerged, still adjusting his tie as he approached the glass doors. At 52, David was one of Chicago's most respected corporate attorneys, a man whose presence commanded immediate attention in legal and business circles. His expression as he approached the entrance made it clear that he was not pleased with what he was seeing. Marcus watched through the glass as David strode across the marble lobby with obvious familiarity and purpose. The attorney's body language conveyed comfort and belonging. He knew this space, these routines, these rhythms. When he reached the entrance and saw Jasmine standing outside with her luggage while Marcus blocked her path, his expression darkened considerably. "Marcus, is it?" David said, reading the security guard's nameplate as he opened the door from inside. "I'm David Kim, managing partner of Kim, Patterson and Associates. We occupy the 14th floor. This is Jasmine Crawford, the owner of this building. She's also my landlord, my friend, and someone who absolutely should not be standing on the sidewalk explaining her right to enter her own property. The words hit Marcus like a series of physical blows. Owner, landlord, friend. Each designation carried weight and implication that his training hadn't prepared him to handle. The confident authority he had projected crumbled as he realized the magnitude of his error. I was just following protocol, Marcus stammered. I don't have her in my authorization files. Your authorization files are apparently incomplete, David said curtly, but that's not Ms. Crawford's problem. It's a problem for whoever failed to provide you with accurate information about building ownership. Jennifer Martinez emerged from the elevator bank, walking briskly across the lobby with a tablet in her hands and an expression that suggested she was prepared to handle a routine security issue. At 34, Jennifer had managed commercial properties for 8 years, but she had never encountered a situation quite like this one. As she approached the entrance and saw the tableau, Jasmine outside with luggage, Marcus looking increasingly uncomfortable, and David Kim radiating professional indignation, her confident stride faltered. The presence of one of the building's most prominent tenants, defending someone her security guard had detained, suggested that this was not a routine verification request. I'm Jennifer Martinez from Hartwell Property Management, she announced as she joined the group. I understand there's some confusion about access credentials? There's no confusion, David said firmly. There's a failure of communication that has resulted in the building owner being treated like a trespasser. Ms. Crawford owns Henderson Tower. She has owned it for 8 years. She employs your company to manage day-to-day operations. The only confusion here is how your security briefing materials could possibly be so incomplete that a new guard wouldn't know who owns the property he's protecting. Jennifer's face went pale as the implications sank in. She looked at her tablet, scrolling frantically through building information and tenant directories. Her property management files were organized by tenant companies and lease agreements, not ownership structures. It was an organizational oversight that had never seemed problematic until this moment. Ms. Crawford, Jennifer said, her voice carrying the careful tone of someone who realized they were in serious trouble, I apologize for this misunderstanding. Our briefing materials focus on tenant information rather than ownership details. It was an oversight on our part. The apology was professional, but felt inadequate under the circumstances. Jasmine had been publicly questioned, detained, and reduced to seeking verification of her own identity at her own property. The damage went beyond simple inconvenience. It was a fundamental failure of respect and recognition that no apology could fully address. An oversight, Jasmine repeated, her voice carrying quiet disappointment rather than anger. An oversight that resulted in me being treated like a suspected criminal at my own building. The gravity of the situation was now clear to everyone involved. What had begun as a security check had evolved into a crisis of competence, communication, and basic respect that would require more than apologies to resolve. Jasmine reached into her briefcase and withdrew a leather portfolio that had traveled with her to countless business meetings across 3 continents. From it, she extracted a document that would end all speculation and transform the morning's confrontation into an unforgettable lesson about assumptions and authority. Since we seem to need documentation, Jasmine said calmly, perhaps this will clarify things. She handed Jennifer the building's deed, an official Cook County document dated 8 years prior, clearly identifying Jasmine Crawford as the sole owner of Henderson Tower. The legal language was precise and unambiguous. Grant, bargain, sell and convey, unto Jasmine Marie Crawford, an individual, the following described real estate. Jennifer's hands trembled slightly as she read the document. The county seal, the notarized signatures, the legal descriptions, everything confirmed what Jasmine had been stating from the beginning. This wasn't a tenant with delusions of grandeur or someone trying to gain unauthorized access. This was the property owner being detained at her own building. This is legitimate, Jennifer whispered, more to herself than to anyone else. She looked up at Marcus, whose face had gone completely white. She really does own the building. Marcus felt the ground shift beneath his feet. Everything he thought he understood about the situation had been turned upside down. The woman he had been treating as a potential trespasser was actually his ultimate employer, the person whose investment made his job possible, whose property he was sworn to protect, whose authority superseded everyone else's in this 30-story tower. I don't understand, he said weakly. Why isn't this information in my files? Why wasn't I told? David Kim stepped forward, his expression mixing professional concern with barely contained frustration. Because the people responsible for briefing you focused on tenant management rather than ownership structure. It's a fundamental failure that has created exactly this kind of situation. But Jasmine wasn't finished. She reached back into her portfolio and produced a series of additional documents that painted the full picture of her relationship to Henderson Tower. Property tax records showing 8 years of payments, insurance policies listing her as the sole beneficiary, renovation permits filed under her name, bank records documenting the original purchase and subsequent improvements. Here's the mortgage payoff letter from 2019, she said, handing Jennifer another document. And here's the certificate of occupancy I received after the 2018 renovation. And this is the business license for Crawford Properties, the company that has managed this building since I purchased it. Each document was another nail in the coffin of Marcus's assumptions. The paperwork created an undeniable timeline of ownership, investment, and stewardship that stretched back nearly a decade. Jasmine hadn't just bought Henderson Tower. She had transformed it from a struggling property into one of Chicago's premier commercial addresses. Jennifer studied the documents with growing horror at the magnitude of the situation. This wasn't just a case of mistaken identity or poor communication. This was a complete systemic failure that had resulted in the building owner being publicly humiliated and detained. "Miss Crawford," Jennifer said, her voice barely above a whisper, "I cannot begin to apologize for this situation. Our briefing material should have included ownership information. This is an inexcusable oversight." But Jasmine still wasn't finished documenting her legitimacy. She pulled out her phone and opened her banking app, showing the account that received monthly rent payments from every tenant in Henderson Tower. The deposits were substantial and regular, $847,000 the previous month from 18 different commercial tenants. "This is where your company deposits the rent checks you collect on my behalf," she told Jennifer, showing her the screen. "Notice the account name, Crawford Properties Holdings. Notice the routing number matches the bank information in your property management system." The financial evidence was overwhelming and irrefutable. Marcus stared at the phone screen, calculating numbers that represented more money than he would earn in several years. The woman he had prevented from entering was receiving nearly $1 million monthly in rental income from the building he was protecting. David Kim seized the moment to drive home the broader implications. "Marcus, do you understand what this means? Miss Crawford doesn't just own this building. She owns 17 commercial properties across 3 states. She's built one of the most successful real estate investment firms in the Midwest. She's not someone who needs permission to be here. She's the person who gives permission for everyone else to be here." The revelation hit Marcus like a physical blow. He thought about his behavior over the past 20 minutes, questioning her credentials, calling for verification, treating her like a suspect. He had been exercising authority over someone whose authority made his own position possible. "I didn't know," he said weakly. "Nobody told me. I was just trying to do my job." Jasmine looked at him with an expression that mixed disappointment with something approaching pity. "Your job, Marcus, is to protect this building and ensure the safety of everyone who works here. But part of that job should involve knowing who you're working for." She turned to Jennifer, whose tablet hung uselessly at her side as she processed the magnitude of the organizational failure. "How many other security guards are working in my buildings without knowing who owns them? How many other situations like this are waiting to happen because basic information isn't being communicated?" Jennifer's mind raced through implications that extended far beyond this single incident. Crawford Properties owned 17 buildings managed by Hartwell Property Management. If their briefing materials were this incomplete for Henderson Tower, what other critical information was missing from other properties? The crowd that had gathered during the confrontation, tenants, passers-by, and Henderson Tower employees, watched in stunned silence as the power dynamics completely reversed. The woman who had been questioned and detained was revealed not just as legitimate, but as the most powerful person in the building. Dr. Patricia Williams, a tenant from the psychology practice on the 9th floor, had been watching the unfolding situation with professional interest. She approached the group with the careful demeanor of someone trained to diffuse tense situations. "Ms. Crawford," she said gently, I've been a tenant here for 6 years, and I want you to know that this behavior doesn't represent the respect and professionalism you've always shown us. This is clearly a training and communication failure, not a reflection of your leadership or the building's values." Her words seemed to break a spell that had held the gathered crowd in silence. Other tenants began stepping forward, offering their own testimonials about Jasmine's character and competence. "She personally helped us through our lease negotiations," said Robert Chen from the accounting firm on 12. "When we had the flooding issue last year, she was here at 6 in the morning to oversee the cleanup," added Sarah Martinez from the consulting group of 23. "She's the most responsive landlord I've ever worked with," said Thomas Anderson from the hedge fund on the penthouse floor. The testimonials created a chorus of respect and appreciation that stood in stark contrast to the suspicion and detention Jasmine had experienced just minutes earlier. Marcus listened to each statement with growing awareness of exactly how badly he had misjudged the situation. Jasmine felt a complex mixture of emotions as she listened to her tenants defend her character and competence, pride in the relationship she had built over 8 years, appreciation for their support in a difficult moment, but also sadness that such defense was necessary, that her presence in her own building had been questioned so thoroughly that it required professional and personal testimonials to validate her existence. The revelation was complete, but its implications were just beginning to unfold. Within 30 minutes of the revelation, Henderson Tower's marble lobby had transformed into an impromptu crisis management center. What had begun as a simple security check had evolved into a situation requiring immediate institutional response, policy revision, and damage control. Jasmine stood near the central reception desk, no longer barred from entering her own building, but now surrounded by a growing circle of people whose jobs had suddenly become much more complicated. Her phone buzzed constantly with messages from other property managers, business partners, and news contacts who had already heard about the incident through Chicago's tight commercial real estate network. Richard Hartwell, the 63-year-old founder of Hartwell Property Management, arrived at Henderson Tower looking like a man whose carefully constructed professional reputation was crumbling in real time. His company managed over 200 commercial properties across the Midwest, but none of those relationships mattered if word spread that they couldn't even brief security guards about building ownership. "Ms. Crawford," he said, approaching with the careful deference of someone who knew his company's future depended on the next few minutes. "I came as soon as Jennifer called. This is an inexcusable failure on our part, and I take full responsibility." Jasmine studied Richard's face, seeing genuine concern mixed with professional calculation. She had worked with Hartwell Property Management for 8 years, and their track record had been solid until this morning. But solid wasn't enough when basic competence failed at such a fundamental level. "Richard, I need to understand how this happened," she said calmly. "Marcus isn't the problem. He was doing what he thought was his job. The problem is that nobody gave him the information he needed to do that job correctly." Marcus, who had been standing awkwardly near the entrance, felt a surge of unexpected gratitude at Jasmine's words. She could have blamed him personally, could have demanded his termination, could have made him the scapegoat for institutional failure. Instead, she was focusing on systemic problems rather than individual mistakes. Jennifer Martinez opened her tablet and began scrolling through security briefing protocols, her face growing paler with each screen. "The briefing materials we provide to security companies focus on tenant contact information, emergency procedures, and access control systems. We don't include ownership structure or property investment details." "Why not?" David Kim asked pointedly. "How can security personnel protect a property effectively if they don't know who owns it?" The question hung in the air like an indictment. Jennifer had no good answer because there wasn't one. The oversight had seemed reasonable when policy was written. Security guards needed to know about tenants and procedures, not financial structures. But the morning's events had exposed the dangerous gap in that logic. Captain Patricia Stevens from Pinnacle Security Services arrived next, her military bearing and crisp uniform, suggesting someone accustomed to handling crisis situations. At 48, she had spent 20 years in corporate security, but she had never encountered a scenario quite like this one. "Ms. Crawford, I'm Patricia Stevens, District Manager for Pinnacle Security," she said, offering a firm handshake. "I want to apologize personally for this incident and assure you that we're taking immediate corrective action." Jasmine appreciated the directness but wasn't interested in hollow apologies. What kind of corrective action? Patricia pulled out her own tablet and began outlining a comprehensive response plan that she had developed during her drive to Henderson Tower. First, we're immediately updating all security briefing materials to include property ownership information. Second, we're implementing mandatory training on professional interaction protocols. Third, we're establishing direct communication channels between building owners and security supervisors. The response was professional and thorough, but Jasmine had spent enough years in business to recognize reactive damage control when she saw it. These policies should have existed already, should have been standard practice rather than emergency measures implemented after a crisis. "How many other properties are you managing without this information?" she asked. Patricia's pause told the story before her words did. "We're conducting a full audit of all briefing materials to identify similar gaps in our protocols." Dr. Williams, the psychology tenant who had spoken up earlier, approached the growing group with professional insight that cut through the administrative discussions. "This isn't just about policies and procedures," she said quietly. "This is about implicit bias and the assumptions people make about authority and belonging." Her words shifted the conversation from operational failure to something more fundamental and uncomfortable. Marcus had questioned Jasmine not just because he lacked information, but because her appearance didn't match his expectations of building ownership. Training could provide information, but addressing bias required deeper institutional change. Richard Hartwell cleared his throat nervously. "We're prepared to offer compensation for this incident, and we'll be implementing comprehensive bias awareness training for all staff members who interact with tenants and property owners." "Compensation," Jasmine repeated, her voice carrying a note of incredulity. "Richard, you can't compensate someone for being treated like a criminal on their own property. Some damage can't be fixed with money." The words hit everyone present with uncomfortable accuracy. The incident had been witnessed by dozens of people, tenants, passers-by, building employees. Videos had likely been taken, stories would be told. Jasmine's professional reputation wasn't damaged, but the experience of being publicly questioned and detained would follow her regardless of how many apologies were offered. Marcus finally found his voice, stepping forward with obvious discomfort but genuine remorse. "Miss Crawford, I know I can't undo what happened, but I want you to know that I'm going to use this experience to become better at my job. I let assumptions guide my actions instead of gathering facts, and that was wrong." His apology was simple but honest, carrying more weight than the corporate damage control happening around them. Jasmine looked at him with an expression that mixed disappointment with something approaching respect for his willingness to acknowledge his mistake directly. "Marcus, I appreciate that," she said, "but here's what I need you to understand. This wasn't just about me. Every time security personnel make assumptions about who belongs somewhere based on appearance, they're participating in a system that excludes people who have every right to be there." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Channel 7 news reporter Amanda Torres, who had received a tip about the incident from someone who had witnessed the confrontation. Her camera operator was already filming as she approached the group in the lobby. "Miss Crawford, I'm Amanda Torres from Channel 7. Can you comment on reports that you were detained by security at your own building this morning?" The question sent a jolt through the assembled group. What had been a private crisis was about to become public news, with implications that extended far beyond Henderson Tower's marble lobby. Jasmine took a deep breath, recognizing that her response would likely be broadcast across Chicago and possibly beyond. The incident had evolved from personal frustration to professional crisis to public relations challenge, each level requiring different skills and different strategies. "I can confirm that there was a misunderstanding this morning regarding building access," she said carefully. "We're using this incident as an opportunity to improve communication and training protocols to ensure it doesn't happen again." Amanda Torres wasn't satisfied with the diplomatic response. "Were you racially profiled by building security?" The question hung in the air like a challenge, forcing everyone present to confront the underlying dynamics that had made the morning's events possible. Jasmine had spent her career navigating similar situations with professional grace, but this time the stakes were higher and the audience was broader. Her answer would determine not just how this story was told, but how it would be remembered. 3 weeks after the Henderson Tower incident, Jasmine Crawford stood before the Chicago Commercial Real Estate Association's monthly meeting, addressing an audience of property developers, investors, and management companies who had gathered to hear her speak about what had become known throughout the industry as the access crisis. The room was packed beyond capacity, with additional attendees joining virtually from across the Midwest. Word had spread quickly through professional networks about the incident, but more importantly about Jasmine's response to it. Rather than pursuing litigation or public condemnation, she had chosen to transform the experience into an opportunity for industry-wide improvement. "The morning I was detained at my own building wasn't an isolated incident," Jasmine began, her voice carrying the confident authority that had built her real estate empire. "It was a symptom of systemic gaps in how our industry approaches security, communication, and inclusion. Today, I want to share what we've learned and what we're implementing to ensure it never happens again." Behind her, a presentation screen displayed the Crawford Properties logo alongside a new initiative, the Dignity in Access Program, a comprehensive framework for inclusive security practices that had already been adopted by 47 commercial properties across 3 states. In the audience, Marcus Johnson sat in the back row, wearing a suit rather than his security uniform. 3 weeks of intensive training, personal reflection, and mentorship had transformed him from a guard following narrow protocols into an advocate for comprehensive security practices that prioritized both protection and respect. The transformation had begun the day after the incident, when Jasmine had personally called Captain Stevens to request that Marcus be assigned to a new role rather than terminated. Instead of punishment, she had proposed partnership. Marcus would become Pinnacle Security's first community relations specialist, helping to develop and implement new training programs based on his first-hand experience of how assumptions could derail professional interactions. Marcus Johnson, who was involved in the original incident, has become one of our most valuable partners in developing these new protocols, Jasmine continued, gesturing toward him in the audience. His willingness to acknowledge mistakes and participate in creating solutions demonstrates the kind of professional growth that benefits everyone. Marcus felt a complex mixture of pride and humility as dozens of industry professionals turned to look at him. 3 weeks ago, he had been a security guard, making minimum wage and following basic protocols. Today, he was earning twice his previous salary while helping to reshape security practices across the commercial real estate industry. The Dignity and Access program had 5 core components, each addressing a different aspect of the problems that had led to the Henderson Tower confrontation. Comprehensive briefing protocols required security companies to provide complete property information, including ownership structure, key personnel, and tenant relationships. No guard would begin work at a property without understanding its complete operational context. Bias recognition training included mandatory workshops on implicit bias, cultural competency, and professional interaction standards. The training used real-world scenarios, including video recreations of the Henderson Tower incident, to help security personnel recognize and overcome assumption-based decision-making. Community integration initiatives established regular interaction between security personnel and building communities. Guards were encouraged to learn tenant names, understand building culture, and see themselves as community members rather than external enforcers. Escalation prevention systems created clear protocols for handling unusual situations that prioritized fact-gathering over assumption-making. When security personnel encountered unfamiliar individuals, the new protocols emphasized investigation over interrogation. Accountability and improvement measures included regular reviews, feedback systems, and continuous training updates based on real-world experiences and changing best practices. Jennifer Martinez, who had been promoted to Regional Training Director at Hartwell Property Management, stood to address the audience about implementation results. In the 3 weeks since we began implementing these protocols, we've seen an 89% improvement in tenant satisfaction scores related to security interactions. More importantly, we've prevented 12 potential incidents similar to what happened at Henderson Tower. The numbers were impressive, but the personal stories were more powerful. Dr. Williams had reported that several of her patients, successful professionals who happened to be people of color, had shared their own experiences of being questioned or challenged in professional settings. The Henderson Tower incident had opened conversations about dignity and respect that extended far beyond building security. Richard Hartwell took the microphone to announce an industry first. Hartwell Property Management is establishing a $500,000 annual fund for bias awareness training and community engagement initiatives. We're also partnering with local universities to research best practices in inclusive security management. The financial commitment represented more than damage control. It was an investment in systematic change that would benefit the entire industry. Other property management companies in the audience began discussing similar initiatives, recognizing that inclusive practices weren't just ethical imperatives but competitive advantages in attracting and retaining quality tenants. Captain Stevens presented data from Pinnacle Security's pilot program implementation across their Chicago portfolio. Properties using the dignity and access protocols have seen 34% fewer complaints, 67% higher security satisfaction ratings, and 23% improved tenant retention rates. Respectful security practices aren't just morally correct, they're economically beneficial. The business case for change was becoming undeniable. Properties that prioritized inclusive security practices were performing better across multiple metrics, attracting better tenants, and building stronger reputations in the competitive commercial real estate market. David Kim approached the podium to share the tenant perspective. As business owners and professionals, we choose office locations based on multiple factors: location, amenities, cost, and culture. The way security personnel interact with us and our clients directly impacts our perception of a property's professionalism and values. His words resonated throughout the room, reminding property owners and managers that security interactions weren't isolated events but integral components of the tenant experience that could influence lease renewals, referrals, and reputation. Amanda Torres, the reporter who had first covered the Henderson Tower story, was present to document the industry response. Her follow-up reporting had tracked the ripple effects of the incident, showing how one morning's confrontation had catalyzed changes across dozens of properties and thousands of professional interactions. What began as a story about discrimination has become a story about transformation, she told the audience during a brief presentation. The Crawford Properties response demonstrates how businesses can acknowledge problems and create solutions that benefit entire industries. Jasmine concluded her presentation by addressing the broader implications of the work they were undertaking. Every person who enters our buildings, whether they're tenants, clients, visitors, or service providers, deserves to be treated with dignity and respect. When we create security practices that prioritize both protection and inclusion, we don't just prevent incidents like Henderson Tower, we build communities where everyone can thrive professionally. The standing ovation that followed wasn't just appreciation for Jasmine's presentation. It was recognition that the industry had embraced a fundamental shift in how it approached security, community, and professional responsibility. As the formal session ended and networking began, conversations throughout the room focused on implementation timelines, training resources, and partnership opportunities. The Henderson Tower incident had become a catalyst for industry-wide improvement that would impact thousands of properties and millions of professional interactions. Marcus found himself surrounded by security supervisors and property managers who wanted to learn more about his transformation and training experience. The young man who had made a career-defining mistake 3 weeks earlier was now helping others avoid similar errors while building a new career in security consulting and training. The transformation was far from complete, but the foundation had been laid for systemic change. 10 years had transformed everything. On a brilliant spring morning in 2034, Jasmine Crawford stood before the inaugural Global Summit on Dignified Development in Dubai, addressing an audience of 3,000 delegates from 89 countries who had gathered to study what historians were already calling the Henderson Tower Revolution, a decade-long transformation of how human beings interact professionally that had originated from a single moment of injustice in a Chicago office building. The Dubai International Convention Center had been specifically chosen for its architectural embodiment of inclusive design principles. Every element of the building, from its barrier-free entrances to its multilingual digital displays, reflected the evolution of thinking that had emerged from Jasmine's experience. The irony wasn't lost on anyone present that they were gathered in a structure that would have been impossible to imagine before the Crawford model fundamentally altered global approaches to commercial development. A decade ago, I was detained at the entrance to my own building by a security guard who made assumptions about my presence based solely on my appearance, Jasmine began, her voice carrying across the vast auditorium through state-of-the-art translation technology that rendered her words simultaneously in 47 languages. Today, the principles that emerged from that painful experience are being implemented in 127 countries, affecting the daily lives of over 200 million people worldwide. The statistics were staggering, almost beyond comprehension. The Crawford model had evolved from emergency damage control into a comprehensive framework for human-centered development that was reshaping entire industries. Commercial real estate, security services, property management, urban planning, and corporate governance had all been fundamentally altered by principles that prioritized dignity alongside efficiency. In the front row sat Marcus Johnson, now 39 years old, and serving as Director General of the United Nations Office for Inclusive Security Practices, a position created specifically to address his expertise in transforming security services worldwide. His journey from the young guard who had made a career-defining mistake to one of the most influential voices in international security policy remained one of the most extraordinary personal transformations of the modern era. Marcus had spent the past decade traveling to every continent, working with governments, corporations, and international organizations to implement security practices that protected while respecting human dignity. His work had influenced national security policies in 34 countries, corporate security standards in thousands of organizations, and educational curricula in security academies from Stockholm to Singapore. The ripple effects continue to surprise us, Marcus told the assembled delegates during his keynote presentation. Last month, I was in Nairobi consulting with the African Union on regional security standards. The practices we developed were being adapted not just for office buildings, but for airports, hospitals, schools, and government facilities across the continent. We've documented cases where improved security-citizen relationships in one sector influenced community trust in other areas, creating positive feedback loops that strengthened entire societies. The African Union Partnership represented just one of dozens of international collaborations that had emerged from the Henderson Tower legacy. The European Union had established continent-wide standards for inclusive security practices. The Association of Southeast Asian Nations had implemented comprehensive training programs based on Crawford Model principles. Latin American countries had formed a regional consortium to share best practices in dignified development. Dr. Patricia Williams, now leading the International Institute for Psychological Safety and Professional Dignity at Oxford University, had spent 10 years researching the global mental health impacts of respectful workplace environments. Her findings had influenced public health policy in 43 countries and been cited in over 2,000 academic papers, exploring the intersection of dignity, productivity, and psychological well-being. What we discovered fundamentally challenged our understanding of human performance in professional contexts, Dr. Williams explained to the Dubai audience. Environments that systematically prioritize dignity and respect don't just prevent negative incidents. They create conditions where human beings flourish in ways we previously thought impossible. Her research had documented extraordinary improvements across multiple measures of human well-being and performance. Companies implementing comprehensive inclusive practices showed 67% higher employee satisfaction, 89% better retention rates, 156% increased innovation metrics, and 234% improved customer loyalty scores. More remarkably, communities surrounding these organizations showed measurable improvements in social cohesion, economic development, and civic engagement. The Henderson Tower building itself had become a UNESCO World Heritage Site, recognized not for its architectural significance, but as the birthplace of a global movement for human dignity in professional contexts. The original marble lobby now housed the Henderson Tower Museum of Professional Dignity, welcoming over 400,000 visitors annually from around the world. The museum's centerpiece was a holographic recreation of the original incident, allowing visitors to experience the confrontation from multiple perspectives while learning about the systematic changes that had emerged from that difficult morning. Interactive exhibits explored bias recognition, assumption-making, and transformational leadership, making the complex psychological and sociological concepts accessible to visitors of all ages and backgrounds. Current tenants of Henderson Tower included the global headquarters of 6 multinational corporations that had specifically chosen the location because of its symbolic significance and practical embodiment of inclusive practices. The building commanded the highest commercial rents in Chicago while maintaining 100% occupancy for 8 consecutive years, proving definitively that ethical practices and financial success were not competing priorities. Jennifer Martinez had transformed her experience into founding the Global Institute for Transformational Property Management, headquartered in Geneva with regional offices on every continent. Her organization had trained over 150,000 property managers worldwide and influenced legislation in 67 countries, establishing national standards for inclusive commercial property management. The transformation has been remarkable beyond our most optimistic projections, Jennifer told the Dubai Summit via holographic presentation from her offices overlooking Lake Geneva. We've documented cases where properties implementing Crawford model principles outperformed traditional approaches by margins we initially thought impossible. But the real success isn't measured in financial returns. It's measured in the millions of people who now experience dignity and respect as fundamental aspects of their professional lives. The financial impact had indeed been extraordinary. A comprehensive analysis conducted by the World Economic Forum estimated that properties and organizations using Crawford model principles had generated over $2.7 trillion in additional economic value over the past decade compared to traditional approaches. The numbers reflected not just higher profits and better performance metrics, but reduced conflict costs, enhanced innovation outcomes, decreased legal liabilities, and increased community investment returns. Captain Patricia Stevens had been appointed as the first Director of Global Security Standards at the World Trade Organization, a position created to address the international implications of security practices on global commerce and development. Her work had influenced trade agreements, international business standards, and diplomatic protocols in ways that were reshaping global economic relationships. Our impact extends far beyond commercial buildings and corporate offices, Stevens explained to the international audience. The principles we developed have been adapted for international borders, diplomatic facilities, cultural exchanges, and trade negotiations. We've shown that security effectiveness actually increases when it's combined with cultural competency and systematic respect for human dignity. The international trade implications have been profound. Countries implementing comprehensive inclusive security practices reported 43% fewer trade disputes, 67% improved diplomatic relationships, and 89% higher foreign investment attraction rates. The Crawford model had become a competitive advantage for nations seeking to participate successfully in the global economy. David Kim's legal practice had evolved into the International Tribunal for Professional Dignity, providing arbitration services for cross-cultural business disputes and advising governments on legislation protecting workplace dignity rights. His expertise had influenced the development of international law recognizing dignified professional treatment as a fundamental human right. The legal evolution has been extraordinary, David explained during his presentation to the Dubai delegates. We've seen the emergence of dignity jurisprudence as a distinct area of international law. Courts in dozens of countries now recognize systematic disrespect in professional contexts as actionable discrimination, and organizations worldwide have revised their policies to ensure compliance with evolving standards. The legal implications had created an entirely new field of jurisprudence. Law schools worldwide now offered specialized programs in dignity law, professional respect litigation, and inclusive organizational governance. The concept of dignified treatment had been incorporated into trade agreements, international treaties, and bilateral cooperation frameworks. Amanda Torres had parlayed her Emmy Award-winning documentary into founding Global Dignity Media, a multimedia platform that had produced over 200 documentaries, educational series, and interactive content exploring dignity, respect, and transformation in professional contexts worldwide. Her content had been viewed by over 500 million people across 89 countries and translated into 76 languages. The Henderson Tower story became a template for understanding how individual courage combined with systematic change could address seemingly intractable social problems, Torres explained during a media panel at the Dubai Summit. We've documented similar transformations in healthcare, education, government services, international development, and dozens of other sectors. The principles are universal, even though their applications are culturally specific. Her media company had documented transformation stories from every continent, showing how Henderson Tower principles had been adapted to address professional dignity challenges in vastly different cultural, economic, and political contexts. The universality of the core concepts, respect, assumption awareness, and transformational response, had proven remarkably resilient across diverse social systems. The Crawford Foundation had distributed over $840 million in grants supporting dignity research, inclusive practices training, and community development initiatives in 127 countries. But beyond financial contributions, the foundation had created a global network of organizations, researchers, practitioners, and advocates committed to advancing dignified professional interactions. Foundation-supported research had documented the applicability of inclusive practices across every major industry and cultural context. Studies in Sao Paulo, Mumbai, Cairo, Stockholm, and Jakarta had shown that while specific implementations varied dramatically based on local customs and economic conditions, the core principles of respect and dignity consistently produced positive outcomes for individuals, organizations, and communities. The academic impact had revolutionized multiple fields of study. Business schools at over 200 universities worldwide had established dedicated programs in dignity-centered management. Psychology, sociology, anthropology, political science, and economics departments had incorporated Henderson Tower research into their core curricula. New academic disciplines had emerged, exploring the intersection of respect, productivity, and social development. Dr. Chen Wei, professor of organizational transformation at Beijing University, had spent 5 years researching the implementation of Crawford model principles in Chinese organizations. Her findings had influenced government policy affecting over 50 million workers and had been adopted as national standards for professional interaction in state-owned enterprises. What we discovered challenged fundamental assumptions about authority, hierarchy, and organizational effectiveness, Dr. Chen told the Dubai audience through real-time translation. Organizations that successfully balanced traditional respect for authority with systematic dignity for all participants didn't just improve employee satisfaction, they became more innovative, more competitive, and more successful in global markets. Her research had documented the phenomenon of cultural dignity synthesis, the process by which universal principles of respect could be integrated with traditional cultural values to create organizational environments that honored both heritage and inclusion. The concept had influenced management theory and practice across Asia, affecting hundreds of millions of workers. The technology sector had been comprehensively transformed by Crawford model principles. Silicon Valley, Shenzhen, Bangalore, and Tel Aviv had become laboratories for testing how inclusive practices could accelerate innovation and improve product development. The results had been so positive that dignity-centered development had become a standard consideration in technology investment decisions. Dr. Amira Hassan, Chief Technology Officer at a major artificial intelligence company, had led the development of dignity assessment algorithms that could analyze organizational cultures and recommend improvements based on Crawford model principles. Her technology was being used by over 10,000 organizations worldwide to continuously monitor and enhance their professional environments. We've proven that dignity isn't just a moral imperative, it's an innovation catalyst, Dr. Hassan explained to the Dubai delegates. Our most breakthrough products have come from teams that exemplify these principles. When people feel genuinely valued and respected, they take creative risks, collaborate more effectively, and produce solutions that would be impossible in traditional hierarchical structures. The healthcare sector had embraced Crawford model principles for both staff relations and patient care. Hospitals, clinics, and public health systems worldwide had discovered that respectful professional interactions improved not just employee satisfaction, but patient outcomes, safety metrics, and community health indicators. Dr. Roberto Silva, director of the World Health Organization's Global Initiative for Dignified Healthcare, had overseen the implementation of inclusive practices in healthcare systems across 47 countries. The results had influenced WHO recommendations and national healthcare policies affecting over 1 billion people. The transformation has been remarkable, Dr. Silva reported to the Dubai Summit. Healthcare environments that prioritize dignity and respect for all participants, staff, patients, families, and community members, consistently produce better health outcomes, higher patient satisfaction, reduced medical errors, and improved community trust in healthcare systems. The educational sector had undergone similar transformation. School districts, universities, and educational systems worldwide had implemented Crawford model principles in their administration, security, and community relations practices. The results had influenced educational policy in dozens of countries and affected the daily experiences of over 100 million students, teachers, and parents. Professor Maria Santos, director of UNESCO's Global Education Dignity Initiative, had coordinated the implementation of inclusive practices in educational systems across Latin America. Her work had influenced national education policies in 17 countries and had been replicated in educational contexts worldwide. We've demonstrated that educational environments prioritizing dignity and respect don't just prevent negative incidents, they create conditions where learning thrives, Professor Santos explained to the international audience. Students perform better academically, teachers report higher job satisfaction, and communities develop stronger relationships with their educational institutions. The international development sector had comprehensively adopted Crawford Model principles for cross-cultural collaboration and community engagement. Aid organizations, diplomatic missions, and international businesses had discovered that respectful interaction practices dramatically improved project outcomes, while reducing cultural conflicts and enhancing local capacity building. Representatives from the United Nations Development Program, World Bank, International Monetary Fund, and dozens of regional development organizations had attended the Dubai Summit specifically to share experiences implementing inclusive practices in their global operations. The principles developed after a security guard detained a building owner in Chicago were being applied to poverty reduction, disaster response, conflict resolution, and sustainable development initiatives worldwide. As Jasmine concluded her presentation to the Dubai delegates, she reflected on the extraordinary journey from that painful morning 10 years earlier to this moment of international recognition and unprecedented global impact. The experience of being detained at her own building had been humiliating and unjust, but it had also revealed opportunities for transformation that had affected the lives of hundreds of millions of people across every continent. The most profound changes often emerge from our most difficult moments, she told the international audience of 3,000 delegates representing governments, corporations, educational institutions, and civil society organizations from around the world. When we choose to respond to injustice with systematic innovation, to bias with comprehensive education, and to exclusion with inclusive community building, we create legacies that transform not just our individual experiences, but the fundamental ways human beings interact professionally across cultures and generations. The standing ovation that followed lasted over 8 minutes, with delegates from 89 countries recognizing not just Jasmine's personal achievement, but the global movement she had catalyzed. Simultaneous translation carried her words across linguistic barriers, while cultural differences dissolved in shared recognition of universal human dignity principles. As the summit concluded and delegates began implementing strategies for their own countries and organizations, the ripple effects of that morning's confrontation in Chicago continued expanding across continents and cultures. From Dubai to Detroit, from Tokyo to Nairobi, from Stockholm to Santiago, people were discovering that the fundamental act of treating each other with dignity and respect could unlock human potential, strengthen communities, and create lasting positive change that transcended every boundary of geography, culture, and circumstance. 10 years after a security guard stopped a black woman at a lobby door, the building she unlocked that morning had become a symbol of transformation that continued opening doors to a more respectful, inclusive, and dignified future for people everywhere. The legacy of Henderson Tower would influence professional interactions, community relationships, and human dignity for generations yet to come, proving that individual courage combined with systematic commitment to respect could indeed change the world. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.